Welcome back to Guys in Magic. My name is Dave. I'm going to be your host today for a deck tech. Today we're going to be taking a look at Braids Arisen Nightmare. In the case you haven't already done so, please make sure that you like and subscribe to this video, and make sure that you also follow us on our other social media platforms, Twitter and Instagram at Guys at Magic. I would love for you to also be able to comment down in the section below. Go ahead and say what it is you do or do not like about this deck tech. Which kind of direction would you have taken the deck in? And are there any other legendary creatures, maybe from Dominaria United, you'd like to have us do a deck tech on? So today we're going to be talking about Braids Arisen Nightmare. This is one of the cards that I'm really excited about whenever I first saw it get spoiled, just because I am super happy that we have Braids back, and I think that she's got a really neat ability on her. So, she is a black and a black for a legendary creature, Nightmare. She's a 3/3, and she says, at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker. If you do, each opponent may sacrifice a permanent that shares a card type with it. For each opponent who doesn't, that player loses 2 life, and you draw a card. I feel like that is a ton of text on this card, and I don't know why Wizards didn't just phrase it as like sacrifice a permanent, because to my understanding, that's all of them. Anyways, though, we're going to go ahead and talk about what we want to do. Braids, generally speaking, wants to kind of fit into a sacrifice deck, but I think she's a little bit on the odd side in that she does give her opponents a choice as to whether or not they're going to be sacrificing their toys. For the most part, we actually want them not to. And I know that that may sound kind of odd at first, but whenever our opponents don't sacrifice things, they lose life, and we get to draw some beautiful, beautiful cards. In a game of EDH, that means that we could potentially be drawing upwards of 3 additional cards on our turn, which is really, really powerful. Generally speaking, we want Braids to just kind of sit in play and act as a value engine for us. To help Braids out, we are going to include some creatures in the deck that are going to be posing as just sacrifice fodder. The first one here is Endrixar, Master Breeder. He is 4 and a black for a 2/2 legendary creature human wizard. It says that whenever you cast a creature spell, put X 1/1 black level creature tokens onto the battlefield, where X is that spell's converted mana cost. Whenever you control 7 or more thralls, sacrifice Endrixar, Master Breeder. This guy is really powerful with this deck because he has the potential to be able to just spew out multiple tokens that we can then use to either gum up the board, serve as blockers, potentially swing with, or use as sacrifice fodder for our commander. One of the things that you do need to kind of keep in mind with this, however, is once you do hit that critical number of 7, sadly you are going to end up sacrificing Endrick himself, so just be wary of that when you're playing. Ophiomancer is 2 and a black for a creature human shaman. She's a 2/2 that states at the beginning of each upkeep, if you control no snakes, create a 1/1 black snake creature token with Death Touch. She makes a ton of snakes, given that you'll only ever have 1 in play at a time, but those make for excellent blockers, seeming as how they have Death Touch, as well as excellent sacrifice tokens. Reassembling Skeleton is 1 and a black for a 1/1 creature skeleton warrior. You can pay 1 and a black and return him from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Although he doesn't make tokens himself, he is great to just be able to die over and over and over again. Pawn of Ulamog is 1 a black and a black. This is the creature that I feel like I've been throwing in pretty much every deck here lately. He's a 2/2 creature vampire shaman. It says that whenever Pawn of Ulamog or another non-token creature you control dies, you may create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token. It has sacrifice this creature, add a colorless mana to your mana pool. Helps us ramp and also gums up the board for sacrifice fodder. Grim Horusfex is 2 and a black for a human wizard. She's a 3/2. She has whenever another non-token creature you control dies, draw a card. You can also morph her for a single black mana, but I'm probably never going to do that. The fact that she has that card draw engine stable onto her is a little bit redundant, given our commander is so good at drawing cards, but I mean, I'm never going to complain at drawing an additional card. Pitiless Plunderer is up next. He is 3 and a black for a creature human pirate. He's a 1/4 that states whenever another creature you control dies, create a colorless treasure artifact, and well, you probably know what the treasures do. This is actually really interesting with this deck because you can use those tokens for either mana or for sacrifice fodder with our commander. Our opponents probably don't want to be sacrificing a ton of artifacts either, so it means that they're probably a little bit more dissuaded to actually feeding into our commander, and we're more likely to have Braids draw us cards and deal some damage, which is really nice. As far as some of the bigger creatures or more impactful creatures in the deck, we do have a couple big drops that we're going to be running. The first one here is Gisa Glorious Resurrector. She is 2 and 2 black for a total of 4. She's a legendary creature human wizard. She's a 4/4 and states if a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. At the beginning of your upkeep, put all creature cards exiled with Gisa Glorious Resurrector onto the battlefield under your control. They gain Decayed. A nice little way for us to be able to not only make some additional fodder for our commander, but also be able to utilize our opponent's creatures and potentially beat in for some extra damage. Tiergrid, God of Fright, is going to be included in this list as well. A lot of people don't necessarily really care much for the way that she interacts, so do kind of keep in mind if you are going to be playing in a blind meta, it may be a good idea to substitute her out for a different card. She's 3 and 2 black for a total of 5 mana. She's a legendary creature god, a 4/5 with Menace, and she states that whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, you may put that card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. There is a backside to it where you can cast Tiergrid's Lantern, but we're probably never going to actually do that given this deck. Tiergrid is such a massive threat because she's going to be able to completely shut down our opponent's sacrifices as well as our opponent's discard. So long as she remains in play, Braids is almost always just going to be dealing damage and drawing us cards, which is fantastic. And then in the odd case that our opponent does choose to sacrifice things, or if they are a deck that just naturally sacrifices, Tiergrid can be an absolute beating. Rankle Master of Pranks is 2 and 2 black for a total of 4 mana. He's a legendary creature fairy rogue. He's a 3/3 with flying and haste, and he's got 3 modes on him. He says whenever he deals combat damage to a player, choose any number of the modes. Those modes include each player discards a card, each player loses 1 life and draws a card, and each player sacrifices a creature. He helps you out with card draw, he helps you out with keeping your opponent's boards nice and small, as well as being able to help discard cards out of your opponent's hand. Now do keep in mind, you're going to be included in whichever ability you choose to use whenever it comes to Rankle, so choose wisely and just kind of fit whatever is most appropriate given the circumstance. Archfiend of Depravity is 3 and 2 black for a 5/4 creature demon. He's got flying, and it says that at the beginning of each opponent's end step, that player chooses up to 2 creatures he or she controls, then sacrifices the rest. We don't really want our opponents to be able to have a ton of creatures, and Braids is probably going to struggle up against a token-based deck where they do have expendable creatures. Archfiend of Depravity does an excellent job in making sure that our opponent's boards stay nice and small. Mikaeus the Unhallowed is 3 and 3 black for a total of 6. He's a legendary creature zombie cleric, a 5/5 with Intimidate that says whenever a human deals damage to you, destroy it. Other non-human creatures you control get +1/+1 and have Undying. In the case that you don't remember or it's new to you, Undying says that whenever a creature with Undying dies, if it had no +1/+1 counters on it, return to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Essentially what this means is if you are going to be sacrificing any of your non-token creatures, they're going to be able to come back. This is absolutely fantastic for you. This is a really powerful effect. There are a couple of human creatures in the deck, so do keep in mind it's not going to be able to grab everything, but it should be able to grab the vast majority of things that you want. It's going to be able to help you out with any additional dice triggers, of course feed the commander, and then if you do have any ETBs that you want to use and abuse, Mikaeus is great there too. Kukasho the Evening Star is one of my favorite creatures to include in a deck that cares about killing off its own things. He's 4 and 2 black for a legendary creature Dragon Spirit. It's a 5/5 with flying and states that whenever it dies, each opponent loses 5 life. You gain life equal to the life lost this way. He helps to pad our life total while also being able to drain our opponents. Junji the Midnight Sky is 3 and 2 black for a legendary creature Dragon Spirit, 5/5 flying menace, and it says whenever it dies, choose 1. Each opponent discards 2 cards and loses 2 life, or put a target non-dragon creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. You lose 2 life. Of course, you can use that second mode to grab a creature from your own graveyard, but you don't actually have to. You can always use your opponent's graveyards as well. This deck does have a pretty considerable artifact sub-theme, and we're going to get into that as well. The reason why I wanted to include so many artifacts in this deck is because that's going to be the permanent type that I think is going to be most common for our opponents not to want to sacrifice. Most decks use artifacts either just kind of exclusively for ramp or maybe a couple of utility pieces here and there, which means they may not have a ton of which that are actually disposable. The first artifact we're going to talk about is Mirror Retriever. This is 2 mana for a 1/1. It's an artifact creature mirror. It says whenever it dies, return another target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. So a nice little piece of recursion there. Scrap Trawler is 3 generic mana for an artifact creature construct. It's a 3/2 with whenever Scrap Trawler or another artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return to your hand target artifact card in your graveyard with lesser mana value. So an even stronger recursion piece here. Filigree Familiar is 3 mana for a 2/2 artifact creature fox. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life, and whenever it dies, you draw a card. Workshop Assistant is 3 generic mana for an artifact creature construct. It's a 1/2 and states that whenever it dies, return another target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Wormcoil Engine is 6 generic mana. It's an artifact creature worm. It's a 6/6 with Death Touch and Lifelink. It also states that whenever it dies, you create a 3/3 colorless worm artifact creature token with Death Touch and another 3/3 colorless artifact worm creature token with Lifelink. So it kind of pseudo replaces itself. Foundry Inspector is 3 generic mana for an artifact creature construct. It's a 3/2. It says that artifact spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Solemn Simulacrum, of course, is going to be included in this artifact deck that cares about killing its own things off. Our Sad Robot is 4 generic mana for an artifact creature golem. It's a 2/2 that states whenever it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle, and whenever it dies, you may draw a card. With us having all of these artifacts, as well as quite a bit more we'll get to later, there are 2 other creatures that I did want to include in here that care a lot about artifacts, but aren't actually artifacts themselves. The first one here is Disciple of the Vault. Disciple of the Vault is a creature human cleric. It's a 1/1 that says whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may have target opponent lose 1 life. Marionette Master is 4 and 2 black for a creature human artificer. It's a 1/3 with Fabricate 3. It says whenever an artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to Marionette Master's power. You probably want to be able to put that Fabricate 3, the 3+1/+1 counters, on Marionette Master. That way she hits a little bit harder whenever you're sacrificing your artifacts. She's a nice little piece to make sure that our opponent's life total is going to be hitting 0 as fast as possible. To round out some of the rest of our creatures, we have Cryptghast. This is 3 and a black. It's a creature spirit. It has Extort. For those of you who aren't familiar, Extort says whenever you cast a spell, you may pay either a white or a black, and if you do, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain that much life. It also says whenever you tap a swamp for mana, you may add an additional black to your mana pool. Essentially, our swamps will tap for 2 black. Mirror Battlesphere is 7 generic mana. It's an artifact creature mirror construct. It's a 4/7, and it says that whenever it enters the battlefield, you will create 4 1/1 mirror artifact creature tokens. Whenever Mirror Battlesphere attacks, you may tap X untap mirror you control. If you do, Mirror Battlesphere gets +X/+O until end of turn and deals X damage to the player or planeswalker it's attacking. 7 mana may be a lot, but you do get 5 bodies off this in order for you to just be able to sacrifice his way. They are all, of course, artifacts here, which add into some of our synergies, and if you need to, this thing can serve as a beater in and of itself. Puppeteer Click is 3 and 2 black. It's a creature fairy wizard. It's a 3/2 with flying. It states that whenever it enters the battlefield, put target creature card from an opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It gains haste, and at the beginning of the next end step, exile it. This creature also has Persist, meaning that whenever it would die, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, you'll return it back to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. It's an abusable creature that'll be able to hopefully grab 2 things out of your opponent's graveyards that we can then use either as sacrifice fodder or just to be able to swing in and beat face with. No sacrifice deck would be complete, of course, without Blood Artist included, so we're going to be throwing 1 in. She is 1 and a black for a creature vampire. She's a 0/1 and states that whenever Blood Artist or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Murderous Rider is going to be included in here because he makes for an excellent sacrifice target, as well as, just generally speaking, a wonderful kill spell. Murderous Rider is 1 and 2 black for a creature zombie knight. It's a 2/3 with lifelink, and states that whenever it dies, put it onto the bottom of its owner's library. It also, of course, has the adventure portion of the card where you can cast it for Swift End, which is 1 and 2 black. That is an instant that states destroy target creature or planeswalker, you lose 2 life. Erebos Bleak-Hearted is up next. He is 3 and a black for a legendary enchantment creature god, a 5/6 with indestructible, and says that as long as your devotion to black is less than 5, Erebos isn't a creature. Whenever another creature you control dies, you may pay 2 life. If you do, draw a card, and you may pay a 1 and a black to sacrifice another creature. Target creature gets -2/-1 until end of turn. Erebos poses not only as just a really solid creature in the deck, having indestructible and being in a mono black deck, he's pretty easy to turn on. In addition to that, he also helps us out with our sacrifice synergies and helps us to draw even more cards. Lastly, the best part about him, he is repeatable removal in the case that we need it. Dauthi Voidwalker is 2 black mana for a creature Dauthi Rogue. It's a 3/2 with Shadow. Shadow means that this creature can only block or be blocked by other creatures with Shadow. It also says that if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, instead exile it with a void counter on it, and you can tap it, sacrifice it, choose an exiled card an opponent owns with a void counter on it, and you may play it this turn without paying its mana cost. A wonderful little piece that we can drop down early and then dissuade our opponents from sacrificing things. Lastly, of course, in our mono black deck that has quite a few sacrifice and quite a few drain effects, we're going to be throwing in Grey Merchant of Asphodel. He's 3 and 2 black for a creature zombie. He's a 2/4 with, whenever he enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, where X is your devotion to black. You gain life equal to the life loss this way. This should pretty consistently be a pretty hefty swing. Although you won't necessarily be able to maybe kill your opponents with it, you should be able to pad your life total by a pretty significant amount. Moving on and away from our creatures, we're going to talk about some of the instants in the deck. Included in the instance, I do have Dark Ritual, which is a single black mana. It's an instant that says add 3 black to your mana pool. This is a wonderful little ramp piece, even if it is just a one-time effect. Similarly, we're going to include Cabal Ritual here. This is 1 and a black for an instant. It says add 3 black mana to your mana pool. It also has Threshold. It says add 5 black mana to your mana pool instead if 7 or more cards are in your graveyard. Infernal Grasp is 1 and a black. It's an instant and says destroy target creature, you lose 2 life, and is going to start some of our removal. Go for the Throat is 1 and a black for an instant stating destroy target non-artifact creature. Tragic Slip is a single black mana for an instant, stating target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, but it has a morbid ability on it that says target creature gets -13/-13 until end of turn instead if a creature died this turn. This should be relatively easy for us to be able to proc. Lastly, to round out the rest of our instants here, we're going to include Defile, which is a single black mana. It says target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn for each swamp you control. Us being in a mono black deck, we have plenty of swamps. As far as our sorceries go, we have Black Sun Zenith, which is X and 2 black for a sorcery. It says put X -1/-1 counters on each creature and then shuffle Black Sun Zenith into its owner's library. It's not necessarily super uncommon, especially for a deck that draws as many cards as this, for us to be able to cast this 2 or potentially even more times over the course of a game. Dead of Winter is 2 and a black for a sorcery. It says all non-snow creatures get -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the number of snow permanents you control. Although we're not quite there yet, later on you'll see that all of our swamps are snow-covered swamps in order to help turn this card on. I really wanted two board wipes in this deck, and given the fact that both of these give minus abilities, especially with Black Sun Zenith being repeatable, I do think that these are going to be able to kill most, if not all, of the creatures that we need to get rid of, and it does help to get around any kind of pesky ability like Indestructible. Sign in Blood is 2 black for a sorcery. It says target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. And Night's Whisper is 1 and a black for a sorcery, saying you draw 2 cards and you lose 2 life. The last sorcery we're going to include here is Feed the Swarm. This is 1 and a black. It says destroy target creature or enchantment an opponent controls. You lose life equal to that permanent's mana value. This is a card that honestly is probably just a shoe-in in any black deck given its versatility and ability to hit enchantments. Speaking of enchantments, we've got a couple in our deck that we want to be able to put down into the battlefield as early as possible. This first category for our enchantments are going to be enchantments that make fodder for us. The first one up here is Bitter Blossom. Bitter Blossom is 1 and a black for a tribal enchantment. It's fairy. It says, at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life, and you create a 1/1 black fairy rogue creature token with flying. Gumps up the board very quickly, and allows us to have those extra sack fodders. Dreadhorde Invasion is 1 and a black for an enchantment, stating that at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and amass 1. Whenever a zombie token you control with power 6 or greater attacks, it gains lifelink until end of turn. If you're not familiar with amass, the way that it works is you would put a +1/+1 counter on an army you control, and if you don't control an army, you create a 0/0 black zombie creature army token. This is going to work somewhat similarly to Bitter Blossom, and then it'll be able to make a token for us. Just keep in mind, if that token does stay around, instead of making a token the following turn, that token will get a +1/+1 counter instead. 2 utility enchantments that I want to include in the deck. The first one here is Dark Prophecy. This is 3 black mana for an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control dies, you draw a card and lose 1 life. I love card draw. Phyrexian Reclamation is a single black mana for an enchantment. You may pay 1 and a black and 2 life. If you do, you return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Seeing as how we're going to be sacrificing so much, I love the recursion aspect of this card. The next 2 enchantments we're going to talk about are just really here to be able to bring the pain and cause our opponents misery. The first one is Grave Pact. This is 1 and 3 black for a total of 4, saying that whenever a creature you control dies, each other player sacrifices a creature. That's great. This is going to make sure that our opponents have nothing in play. Dictate of Erebos is a 3 and 2 black for an enchantment with flash. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. These 2 cards work incredibly similarly to each other. I do actually prefer Dictate of Erebos because of the flash ability on it, but just keep in mind it does cost 1 more. We're going to be moving on to the rest of the artifacts that we talked about earlier. The first group of artifacts that we have are going to be talking about just kind of great sacrifice targets. This first one is Ugin's Nexus. It's 5 generic mana for a legendary artifact, saying that if a player would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. If Ugin's Nexus would be put into a graveyard from the battlefield, instead exile it and take an extra turn after this one. By sacrificing this, it gives us an extra turn, and hopefully draws us a couple of cards. Terrarian is just 1 generic mana for an artifact. It says it enters the battlefield tapped. We can pay 2 mana, tap and sack it to add 2 mana in any combination of colors. We'll probably just choose 2 black. The reason why I really like this card, though, is because whenever it's put in the graveyard from the battlefield, you draw a card. So, in a sense, it kind of cantrips itself. Mycosynth Wellspring is 2 mana for an artifact. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, or whenever it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. Not quite ramp, but it does make sure that we're going to at least hit our land drops. Ichor Wellspring is 2 mana for an artifact that says whenever it enters the battlefield, or whenever it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. Lastly here for our great sack artifacts, we have Spine of Ishsa. This is 7 mana, so it's a bit expensive, but it says whenever it enters the battlefield, destroy target permanent. Whenever it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield, return it back to its owner's hand. This is a repeatable engine for us to be able to just go ahead and drop into play, blow up a pesky permanent, possibly even one of our opponent's lands, sacrifice it to draw some cards, and then bring it back to our hand to just use over and over and over again. The next group of artifacts are mainly going to be focused on utility. The first one here is Whip of Erebos. This is 2 and 2 black for a legendary enchantment artifact, stating that creatures you control have lifelink. You can also pay 2 and 2 black and tap it. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste. You'll exile it at the beginning of the next end step, and if it would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. You can only activate this as a sorcery. This is a nice little recursion piece, plus it gives our creatures lifelink. Crucible of Worlds is going to be included in this deck. It's 3 mana for an artifact that allows you to play lands from your graveyard. We haven't really talked about it up to this point, but super important note on Braids, if you need to, you can blow up your own lands. So if you've noticed, for example, you're flooding and just need the card draw, go ahead and start sacrificing your own lands here. Chances are your opponents probably are not going to want to blow their lands up. Skull Clamp is a single mana for an artifact equipment, giving it the equipped creature +1/-1. And it also states whenever the equipped creature dies, you'll draw 2 cards. It has an equip cost of just 1. Caged Sun is 6 mana for an artifact. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, choose a color. You're going to choose black. Creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+1. And whenever a land's ability causes you to add 1 or more mana of the chosen color, add 1 additional mana of that color. So all of our swamps will be able to tap for 2. Lastly here, we have Strionic Resonator, which is 2 mana. You can pay 2 and tap it to copy target triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. We'll be using this to copy Braids trigger. That way we could potentially be able to sacrifice 2 of our things, draw a ton of extra cards, and ping our opponents for some extra life. To round out the rest of our artifacts, we're going to be talking about some of the mana rocks that are going to help this deck tick. I'm really not going to go into detail on most of these because, generally speaking, I feel like for the most part, you kind of know what they do. The first one here is Arcane Signet. We're also going to include Soul Ring, Felwar Stone, Mind Stone, Charcoal Diamond, and Thought Vessel. Now, Thought Vessel also super important in this deck because it gives us no maximum hand size, and we definitely want that, considering we should be drawing tons of cards. The last rock here that we're going to talk about isn't quite a rock in and of itself, but it definitely helps us out with our ramp. This is Bontu's Monument. It's 3 mana for a colorless legendary artifact that makes our black creature spells cost 1 less to cast, and whenever we cast a creature spell, each opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. Although not super oppressive, that little drain effect is pretty nice. We have 2 Planeswalkers that we're going to include in this deck. The first one here is Liliana, Dreadhorde General. She is 4 and 2 black for a legendary Planeswalker, Liliana. Says whenever a creature you control dies, draw a card. She's got a +1 of create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. A -4 of each player sacrifices 2 creatures. She's got a -9 of each opponent chooses a permanent they control of each permanent type and sacrifices the rest. She is a super powerful draw engine. She makes tokens for us to be able to sacrifice, while also then being able to draw cards whenever we do sacrifice said tokens. And in the case that we do end up getting to ever ultimate her, she'll just outright win us the game. Sorin Markov is 3 and 3 black for a total of 6. He's a Planeswalker that comes in with 4 loyalty. His first ability is a +2, saying Sorin Markov deals 2 damage to target creature or player, and you gain 2 life. He's got a -3 that says target opponent's life total becomes 10. Just to give you a heads up, we're going to use that the turn he drops about 99% of the time, just because it's going to nuke one of our opponents, put them at a very uncomfortable life total, and then from there, hopefully either our drain effects will just be able to kill them, or they're going to be so scared that they're going to want to start sacrificing their things so that Braids doesn't hurt them. He does, of course, have an ultimate as well. It's a -7 that says you control target player during that player's next turn. These kind of effects are typically pretty nasty. You'll spend just about every relevant removal piece that they may have in their hand on their own creatures, swing in for a very unprofitable attack, and then just leave them very exposed. Lastly, to fill up the rest of this deck, we're going to talk about our lands. The first land that we're going to include here is Malakir Rebirth, or Malakir Mire. Technically not actually entirely a land. Malakir Rebirth is a single black mana for an instant. It says choose target creature, you lose 2 life. Until end of turn, that creature gains whenever this creature dies. Return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. It's a little recursion piece that does have a timing element to it, but I do love the fact that it's going to be in this deck, not only just because of that, but in the case that we don't need it, we can have it interplay as Malakir Mire, which will later be able to tap for a black. Bojuka Bog is a land that says whenever it enters the battlefield, we exile target player's graveyard. It does enter the battlefield tapped, and then of course we can tap it to add a black. I think this is probably a necessity card in any mono black deck, or really just most decks running black, because it shuts off our opponent's graveyards. Cabal Coffers is up next. You can pay 2 mana, tap it, and if you do, you add a black mana for each swamp you control. Similarly to that, we have Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. It's a legendary land. You can tap it, add 1 mana to your mana pool, Or you can pay 2 mana, tap it, choose a color, and add mana to your mana pool equal to the amount of your devotion to that color. That means the total number of pips of that color in the permanents you control. Seeing as how we're a mono black deck, that should be quite a bit of black mana. Now, just to give you a quick heads up, in the case you are looking to build this deck a little bit more on the budget side, Cabal Coffers and Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, although not necessary, are very powerful cards in mono black decks, and they do also bring with them a pretty hefty price. The two of these cards together come up to about $60, $70, so if you're looking to build this a little bit more budget, my recommendation probably be cut these two. Rogue's Passage could be tapped for a colorless mana. You can also pay for and tap Rogue's Passage to have target creature can't be blocked this turn. Kind of a nice little interesting interaction is that you can actually use this on opponent's creatures as well. Say, for example, if opponent A attacks opponent B. Lastly, to round up this deck and to make sure that we finish it off, we're going to be including some snow-covered swamps, 27 of them to be exact. I did want to include those because we do have a card in the deck, at least a board wipe, that I did really want to include in here that specifically cares about those snow-covered permanents. Now, if you're looking to build this deck exactly as we have it here in this list, it comes up to about $400. You can definitely cut some of the cards in here. There are a couple of key pieces that are kind of a bit more on the expensive side. Things like I mentioned already about Nykthos and then also Cabal Coffers. If you're looking to also kind of cheapen this a little bit more, some of our token makers in here, for example, things like Bitter Blossom holds a pretty price tag, and Grave Pact, also another one of our cards that is above the $25 mark. So just a couple things to kind of keep in mind there. I do think that Braids is a really interesting commander. To be completely honest with you, I don't necessarily think she's the most powerful commander given the fact that she gives your opponents choice, and on her own, she's not necessarily really all that oppressive. She's an excellent draw piece though, so if you enjoy playing a little bit more of a controlling game, sacrificing your own stuff, or really love drawing cards, I think this would be a fantastic deck for you. Let me know down in the comments below what it is that you liked about this deck tech or what you didn't like. How would you like to build this deck a little bit differently? Would you think that you might want to focus on a different permanent type, maybe something else for Braids to be able to sacrifice away? Thank you so much for following along, and we love all of the support that you've given us. Look forward to the next deck tech with you guys. Peace.